Chapters 15 and 16 of Anybody But Anne by Carolyn Wells. This recording is in the public domain. 15. Who wrote the letter? The next day was Sunday. As the inquest was not to be continued, I hoped for a quiet day; but aside from the necessary arrangements for funeral appointments, there seemed to be much going on in the way of investigations. Mr. Markham had developed a tendency to question everybody right and left, and I continually ran against him interviewing a servant, a guest, or a caller. I hung around somewhat listlessly, hoping to be permitted to see Anne, but Miss Fordyce informed me that Anne refused to see anyone except her two stepchildren. I strolled out on the terrace, hoping to have a talk with Archer, but instead I met Mr. Markham, and he proceeded briskly to interview me. I had no objection to this, as, although there were a few things I knew that I intended to keep from him, I was quite willing to give him freely any other information I possessed. But his talk, after all, was a repetition of what I already knew, or a verbose disquisition on his own theories and plans. As we talked, Mrs. Carstairs came out on the terrace, and after a curious glance about she glided up to us with a mysterious air. "May I speak to you a minute, Mr. Markham?" she said, and though I disliked and distrusted the woman, I could not help admiring her beauty and grace. She was truly unusual in her charm, and Markham beamed on her with a smile at once admiring and deferential. "Shall I remain?" I asked, and for the life of me I couldn't help speaking kindly to her. "Or do I intrude?" "Not at all," she replied. "I should be glad, Mr. Sturgis, for you to hear what I have to say. I am in a dilemma, and I don't know exactly what I ought to do. I found this," and she produced a letter, which, with a hesitating air, she offered to Mr. Markham. "I hate to bring it to you," she went on, half withdrawing it as he was about to take it, "and yet I feel it my duty to do so." "I'm sure it is your duty, madam," said the detective, as he somewhat eagerly took the letter from her hand. I caught sight of the inscription, and a fierce anger kindled within me. "That is a letter to Mrs. Van Wyck," I exclaimed. "You have no right to read it, Mr. Markham. Mrs. Carstairs, where did you get it?" My vehemence seemed to frighten her, and she clasped her hands to her breast with a little fluttering motion. "Oh, have I done wrong? Shall I put it back? I thought that in a case like this, you know, it was one's duty to tell, if one found important evidence." Of course this was enough for Markham, and he held the letter firmly, with no intention of giving it up. But I made another desperate attempt. "Mr. Markham, you shall not read that letter without Mrs. Van Wyck's permission. Have you read it?" and I turned and glared at the housekeeper. "I have," she said softly, with a look of pain in her deep eyes. "Oh, believe me, I did not know it was wrong. I thought I ought to." "And you are right, madam," said the detective. "Mr. Sturgis knows you are right. It is only his personal feeling that makes him want to withhold the information this letter may give." "Oh, is that it?" And Mrs. Carstairs did not glance at me, but confined her attention to Markham. "Then you will read it, won't you, and tell me I was right in bringing it to you? I was so uncertain what to do. If Mr. Sturgis does not want to hear it, perhaps he had better go away." In my indignation I was quite ready to walk away rather than be a party to this disgraceful act, but as she spoke, Mrs. Carstairs swept me a glance in which, beneath its apparent frankness, I thought I caught a malevolent gleam, and I promptly decided that I preferred to know all that anyone else knew, either for or against Anne. The letter had been opened, and without further hesitation Mr. Markham drew the paper from its envelope. It was a half sheet, and its message was typewritten. The detective did not read it aloud, but as I looked over his shoulder, we two scanned its contents at the same time. There was no address, no preliminary greeting of any sort, but it was dated Friday. Then the message ran: "To-night is the time. After the committee meeting. Don't be afraid. You can never be found out. I will protect you and look out for you." There was no signature. I read the lines twice, but even then was unable to sense their purport. I took the sheet from Markham and scrutinized it closely. Meanwhile he examined the envelope. There could be no doubt of its genuineness. It was addressed in typewriting to Mrs. David Van Wyck, Buttonwood Terrace, Town, and it bore the postmark of 2 days before, and of the Crescent Falls village post office. A postmark on the back showed that it had been mailed Friday morning and received the same afternoon. It had been opened neatly, and gave every evidence of being a letter received and read by Anne Van Wyck on Friday. And it was on Friday night that David Van Wyck had died. The half sheet of paper was undoubtedly from the same box of stationery as the envelope. Both were of good style, rather large size, and of good quality. Mr. Markham read it over several times, and at last he said, "This is of very grave import. You did quite right, Mrs. Carstairs, to bring it to me. Where did you find it?"
"It was in a book which lay on a table in Mrs. Van Wyck's dressing room. I chanced to pick up the book to put it away in its place, and this letter fell out."
"And you deliberately read it!" I exclaimed, and I dare say I glared at her.
"Perhaps I ought not to have done so, Mr. Sturgis, but I can't help thinking that in such a mysterious case as we have before us now, certain conventional rules may be laid aside."
"I quite agree with you, madam," said the detective, "and I can't help thinking that this is a most important piece of evidence. Is it your habit to look after Mrs. Van Wyck's belongings?"
"It is my duty to see that her rooms are kept in immaculate order. And unless I show a certain amount of oversight, sometimes the maids become a little careless in their care of the appointments of her dressing table and such matters. And so, as I was in there this morning on a tour of inspection, I found this letter, as I have told you."
I was absolutely crushed. I felt as if a black mantle had fallen over me like an enveloping pall. Not for a moment did I believe Anne guilty even of complicity in her husband's death, but I realized that my refusal to believe it was based solely on my unwillingness to do so. However, the thought flashed through my mind that this letter was dangerous and it must be destroyed or suppressed. I knew, too, that Mr. Markham was ready and eager to make use of it, and I concluded that the only thing I could do was to beg for time. So I said, "I quite agree with you, Mr. Markham, that this is a serious matter. So much so that I think you will both be willing to agree to my proposition, which is to say nothing about it for a day or two. Let us at least wait until after Mr. Van Wyck's funeral, which takes place to-morrow afternoon. I think it only decent courtesy that all investigation should be postponed until after that." Mr. Markham considered this matter. "It might be well to adopt that course," he said slowly, "though of course I shall conduct personally and privately any investigation I choose. But I'm quite willing to agree that the whole matter shall not be mentioned to any member of the family until after the funeral."
"Perhaps it need never be mentioned," said Mrs. Carstairs, and her face was drawn with sorrow. "I'm just beginning to realize what it would mean if this discovery of mine were made public. Why, it is practically a condemnation of Anne Van Wyck."
"It is nothing of the sort," I cried out angrily. "It is doubtless a harmless communication on a totally different subject. There is really nothing to connect it with the crime in the study." "Don't talk rubbish," said Mr. Markham testily. "If ever a bit of evidence pointed straight to a criminal, this certainly does. There can be no doubt of its genuineness. The date and postmarks prove that Mrs. Van Wyck received this letter on Friday afternoon. The fact that it was found in a book which she had been reading proves that she received and opened it herself. If all this is not so, what is your explanation of the incident, Mr. Sturgis?"
"Yes, do tell us," said Mrs. Carstairs, wringing her beautiful hands. "I should be so glad to put any construction on it favorable to Mrs. Van Wyck. Would it be better to go to her and ask her frankly what it means?"
"No," I thundered. "That poor woman is not to be harassed any more than is necessary during these awful days. You have both promised to keep this matter a secret until after the funeral, and I hold you to your word." To my relief, they both agreed to this, and promised not to mention that awful letter to any one at present. I looked curiously at Mrs. Carstairs. As always, she mystified me, and yet I couldn't say how or why. Surely she had been guilty of a breach of good manners in reading a letter addressed to another. But in her opinion the occasion had justified it; and doubtless many people would agree with her. Really, I could not help distrusting her, in spite of the fact that she now expressed so much sympathy for Anne, and seemed so truly grieved at the thought of her trouble that she seemed to be sincere. And again, what could she have done with the letter better than to bring it straight to the detective? It was the most logical proceeding, and the most just. If she had taken the letter to Morland or Barbara, it might have made infinitely more trouble. I walked away, leaving the two on the terrace still conferring on the matter. As I turned aside, I heard Markham say, "What was the book in which you found the letter?" And Mrs. Carstairs replied, "A volume on rose culture." The question struck me as absurd, for what difference could it possibly make what the subject of the book might be? I walked along the terrace and down into the gardens. Finding a pleasant seat on one of the bypaths, I sat down there to think it over. I didn't need the letter to look at; its words were branded into my brain. Alone by myself, I was forced to admit that the letter, if genuine, was definitely condemning. And it was genuine, beyond a doubt. Anne had certainly received that letter on Friday. The letter stated that after the committee meeting that same night was the time for some preconcerted plan to be carried out. That the plan was a dangerous one was proved by the wording of the letter. And it was shortly after that committee meeting that David Van Wyck had died a violent death. I forced myself to face the matter squarely. Not because I believed it, but merely as a necessary argument, I accepted the implication that the letter conveyed. Then it would mean that Anne had an accomplice, or at least an adviser in the matter. Who could the accomplice be? But my mind refused to work in that direction, and I resolutely pushed the matter out of my mind and began to think what I could do to help and protect Anne if she should be accused. I almost thought of urging her to run away with me while she yet had opportunity to escape. And as my thoughts were in this turmoil, Anne herself came walking along the path near me. Her soft, trailing black garments made her beautiful face seem whiter than ever. "Sit down, Raymond," she said as I rose. "Talk to me a little, can't you? I feel dazed and weak." Surely this was no time to ask questions, so I talked to her gently on casual subjects, and after a time the conversation veered around to the tragedy. "I felt a premonition something would happen that night," said Anne, her large dark eyes growing misty with the memory. "I was so restless I couldn't go to bed, and I wrote letters and read until quite late." "What were you reading, Anne?" "I was looking through a book about rose growing. The gardener had been asking me about some new varieties he had just bought. I'm interested in such things, and the book was well written. But I never want to see it again. Or a rose, either." There was a look of horror in her eyes, and I felt that the rose book brought back the scenes of that dreadful night so poignantly that she could scarcely bear it. I changed the subject, and persistently led her mind away from the scene of the tragedy. "You always do me so much good, Raymond," Anne said gratefully, as at last we started back to the house. "You always know just what to say to me. You're a real comfort." "You need and deserve comfort, Anne," I said gently. "And I think you know you may always depend upon me to give you all I can. And, Anne, if you ever want more of me, if you want real assistance, or if you want to confide in me, you will do so, won't you?" She turned to me with a startled look. "Why, what do you mean?" she asked, and her voice quivered, and she almost gasped for breath. I looked her straight in the eyes. "I don't mean anything," I said, "except that I am your friend through any circumstance that may come to you. In any trouble or danger, count on me." "Even if I have been wicked?" said Anne in a whisper. "Yes, even then." But a pang shot through my heart, not so much because of the words she said, as the look of horror and despair that came into her eyes. The days went by slowly. On Monday the funeral was held, and with appropriate obsequies the body of David Van Wyck was buried. The house guests had all chosen to remain at Buttonwood Terrace, in response to Anne's urgent invitation that we should do so. She seemed to have a dread of being left alone with her stepchildren, and it became more and more evident that matters were far from harmonious between her and David Van Wyck's son and daughter. The day after the funeral I had a long talk with Mr. Markham. "There is no doubt in my mind," he declared, "that Mrs. Van Wyck is the guilty party. We never can fasten the crime upon her, for it cannot be explained how she left the room locked up; but it must be that she did so in some clever way." "But there isn't any such way," I objected. "If it were the mere turning of a key, it might be done from the other side, but heavy bolts cannot be shot into their sockets except by a person on the inside of the room. And again, waiving the mystery of the locked room, we are as well justified in suspecting Morland or Barbara as Anne." "That is true," agreed Markham, "but the stiletto was found in her room, and her maid is missing, and then there is that mysterious letter. That mystery must be sifted out. To my mind it would be better to put the question plainly to Mrs. Van Wyck and ask her what it means." "I wish you'd try some other way first," I said. "What's the use of being a detective if you can't trace a letter to its source without asking anybody? Why, if Fleming Stone saw that letter, he'd soon tell you who wrote it and what it all meant." Mr. Markham didn't like this speech, and I didn't blame him. I dare say I ought not to have said it. But he had so little of what is known as the detective method that I couldn't help speaking my mind. "Well, I'll tell you one thing I think about it," he said. "That is, whoever wrote that letter to Mrs. Van Wyck was certainly her accomplice. Now, who could that be but that valet Carstairs? He has acted queer from the beginning, and I'm going to hunt him up and make him tell all he knows." "Carstairs!" I exclaimed in amazement. "You don't think Mrs. Van Wyck would stoop to receive letters from a servant?" "If Mrs. Van Wyck has stooped to crime, or participation in crime, she cannot be very particular about her associates." "But she hasn't stooped to crime. Good heavens, man, don't condemn her unheard." But, even as I spoke, I remembered that Anne had asked me if I would stand by her even if she were wicked; and I had said I would. Yes, and I would, too, even if she were convicted of the worst crime in the calendar. I don't know whether it was because of my reference to Stone or not, but Markham seemed to acquire new energy. He announced with great determination that he was going to find out about that letter whatever method he might have to pursue. And it was partly to divert his sudden energy from this subject that I proposed again that we should make a search for Jeanette. "Strange about Jeanette," I observed. "Suppose we set out to trace her. That would be at least a step in the right direction." "There have been very few steps taken in any direction," said the detective moodily. "My own movements are hampered by orders from the family. Of course there's no one to say what I shall do except Mrs. Van Wyck and her two stepchildren. And every direction in which I wish to investigate is forbidden by one or another of those three. Sometimes I think they are all in connivance, and their inharmonious attitude toward one another is a mere bluff." This was a new idea to me, and I pondered it. But I couldn't think it a true theory, and said so. "Maybe not, said Markham, "but they do act mighty queer. Miss Barbara, for instance, begged me if I found any clues which might incriminate her brother, to suppress them and tell nobody." "Did she really suppose that you would do that?" I asked. "Yes, she was very much in earnest. But I haven't found anything that points to Morland definitely. If I did, I'd show it up fast enough." "I should hope so," I returned emphatically. "I'd far rather suspect Morland of his father's death than Mrs. Van Wyck." "Yes, so should I. But it's a mystery whichever way one turns. I can't seem to make any start. But as you say, Mr. Sturgis, it would be a good idea to hunt for that maid." It proved not to be a difficult matter to find Jeanette, for we soon discovered that she had gone to stay with her sister in a neighboring village. I couldn't help thinking that Anne had known all along where the girl was, for she seemed rather annoyed than otherwise that we had made the discovery. At any rate, Jeanette was brought home, and closely questioned by Mr. Markham and myself. And the result of the questioning was to eliminate entirely the stiletto as incriminating evidence. Jeanette explained that she had used that stiletto to dig a refractory cork out of a bottle of bronze shoe dressing. The bronze had given the metal a reddish stain, which she could not remove, and she had hidden it, lest she be scolded for having used the dainty implement for such a purpose. Markham was frankly disappointed. I can't think he wanted to prove Anne guilty, but his pride was hurt at having his cleverness in finding the stiletto of no avail. "But," I said to Jeanette, "why did you run away?"
I didn't run away," she said. "I merely went to visit my sister."
"But you took a strange time to do that, when your mistress was in such trouble and sorrow."
"I thought I'd better go," responded Jeanette,
and Markham jumped at this admission. "Why did you think it better to go?" he demanded. But Jeanette turned pale and looked very much frightened.
"I didn't have any reason,"
she said, beginning to cry.
I just thought I'd go."
We tried every possible way to learn more from her, but without success. She became hysterical and stupid by turns, and finally refused to answer our questions. Markham declared that this attitude on Jeanette's part was strongly against Anne, but this I would not believe. Finally I said, "Jeanette, the reason you refuse to talk is because you're afraid of Carstairs. Now I'll tell you, it will be better in the long run if you make a clean breast of this matter and tell us all you know." And then, between her hysterical sobs, Jeanette managed to stammer out that Carstairs had said he would kill her if she told. Certainly she was weak-minded, and I thought the best thing was to scare her a little. "Nonsense, Jeanette," I said. "Of course Carstairs won't kill you. Don't be so foolish. But you may get into very serious trouble if you don't tell this thing that you're keeping back. How would you like to go to prison for withholding evidence?" The girl shivered at the thought, and a little more of this sort of persuasion soon brought her to the point of saying that she would tell all she knew, but that she knew nothing of importance. "We will judge of the importance," I said, "and what we want from you is a full account of anything you know concerning last Friday night. In the first place, were you at that ball in the village?"
"No, sir."
The answer, though in low tones, was positive. "Was Carstairs at that ball?"
"No, sir."
"Where were you both?" It seemed almost as if the girl were hypnotized by my question, for she spoke like one in a trance. Nevertheless, her answers bore the stamp of truth, and it seemed impossible to doubt that she was telling a straight story. In the same low, steady voice, Jeanette went on.
"We both went for a ride in Mr. Van Wyck's new car. This was forbidden, of course, but Carstairs said his master would never find it out."
"You went then on what is called a joy ride?"
"I suppose so."
"And what time did you get home?"
"About midnight."
"Then it was Carstairs that Miss Fordyce saw sneaking into the grounds?"
"I don't know, sir, but Rennie saw us, and Carstairs made him promise not to tell."
"At last we're getting at something definite," said Mr. Markham, fairly rubbing his hands with pleasure at these new developments. He then took up the work of questioning himself. "You came into the house about 12 o'clock that night?"
"Yes, sir."
"And then what did you do?"
"I stopped in the servants' dining room, sir, and in a few minutes Carstairs came in there after putting away the car. He said nobody had seen us except Rennie, and he wouldn't tell. Then he told me I'd better go and see if Mrs. Van Wyck wanted me. So I started for Mrs. Van Wyck's room, but before I reached it, I saw her coming out of the study."
"Coming out of the study? Be careful what you're saying, girl. Are you sure of this?"
"Of course I'm sure. Mrs. Van Wyck had one of her boudoir gowns, and she was just coming through the study door into the corridor as I saw her. I asked her if she wanted me to help her undress."
"And what did she say?" The detective was almost breathless now in his excitement.
"She said, 'No, no! For heaven's sake, go away!'"
"Why did she speak like that?"
"I don't know, sir. She was greatly excited, and her eyes were blazing like stars. She was clutching her hands, and she looked almost distracted."
"Jeanette," I said very sternly, "you're telling the truth?"
"Only the truth, sir. I was frightened at Mrs. Van Wyck's appearance, but as she said she didn't want me, I went straight back to the servants' dining room. I found Carstairs there, and he looked frightened and white, too. I was all upset, sir, at these queer actions, and I said good night to Carstairs, and went right up to my room."
"At what time was all this?" asked Mr. Markham.
"When I reached my bedroom it was 12:30.
Mr. Markham looked at the girl thoughtfully. "I believe your story," he said, "but you will have to tell it again under oath. And in the meantime I forbid you to mention a word of this to anyone. Do you understand? I forbid you."
"Yes, sir."
"You ought to have been here and given this evidence at the inquest. Why did you go away just then? You may as well own up."
Jeanette hesitated only a moment, and then she said, simply, "Mrs. Carstairs advised me to go."
"Mrs. Carstairs? Why did she do that?"
"I don't know, sir. She said for me to go to my sister's for a day or two, and make a little visit."
"That is all for the present, Jeanette," said Mr. Markham. "You may go now. But remember, you are not to say a word about all this to anyone."
"I will remember, sir," said Jeanette, and she went away.
16. Telltale Typewriting. After the girl had gone, Mr. Markham looked at me significantly. "We certainly have material to work on now," he said. "What do you make of it all, Mr. Sturgis?" "I can't make anything of it," I replied. "It has all come upon me so suddenly it makes my head whirl. Of course I see, as you do, that this girl's story is pretty strong evidence against Mrs. Van Wyck, but I, for one, am not willing to take the unsupported evidence of a hysterical and weak-minded servant. But how can you doubt it? The girl would never have made up all that story. You don't question, do you, the fact that she saw Mrs. Van Wyck coming from the study soon after midnight? Then how do you explain Mrs. Van Wyck's presence there after the men of the committee had gone home and the secretary had also? How do you explain the fact that she was wringing her hands in a state of great excitement, and even spoke sharply as she declined the services of the maid? I don't explain these facts if they are facts. But, as I said, I'm not prepared to believe this story implicitly. I do believe those two went on a joy ride, and they came home so frightened lest their misdemeanor should be discovered that they haven't a very clear recollection of what happened. At least the girl hasn't, and as you may remember the valet was decidedly nervous and uncertain of his facts when he gave his own testimony. Besides telling an up-and-down lie as to his whereabouts that evening." "That's all so," said the detective musingly. "They're both servants. They had both been doing wrong, and were both fearful of discovery. But all that would not cause them to invent this story of the maid's about seeing Mrs. Van Wyck coming from the study. Now, if, as I think, Carstairs was mixed up in the matter, may it not be that it was because she feared for her son's safety that Mrs. Carstairs sent the girl Jeanette away?" I pondered on this. I knew how Mrs. Carstairs idolized her son. I knew she had been out early that next morning endeavoring to obliterate the wheel tracks of the new car, which might tell the tale of his wrong doing. And knowing Jeanette's hysterical nature, the housekeeper might very easily have felt afraid that the maid's evidence would lead to suspicion of her son, and so she sent the girl away. It all looked plausible, so plausible that my fears for Anne grew deeper, and the future looked very black indeed. "If my theory is right," Markham went on, "that there is collusion between Mrs. Van Wyck and the valet, I think the best plan is to question him. I think if sufficiently frightened he will tell the truth. And now he has no fear of punishment for his stolen ride, he will probably make up some other story, and I may yet catch him tripping. But I think this, Mr. Sturgis, I think it is high time we gave all this information to the other members of the family. My way would be to go straight to Mrs. Van Wyck with the whole story. But if not that, I think at least Miss Van Wyck and her brother should be told all of this. They are practically my employers, and my report is due to them." "Give me a little more time," I begged. "Wait till to night, won't you? If I could prove this girl's story false, how much better not to have insulted Mrs. Van Wyck with a recital of it. It seems to me, Mr. Sturgis, that you're assuming a great deal of responsibility in the matter. But who else is there to take the helm? Morland Van Wyck is not one to deal with such things, and the ladies could not be expected to do so." And then, as it was tea time, we joined the others in the music room. Of course, since the tragedy, tea had not been served in the study, and the beautiful music room made an attractive setting for the dainty function. As was to be expected, there was an air of constraint over us all, and instead of general conversation, we broke up into small groups and conversed in low tones. As was not unusual, Morland and Barbara were disagreeing on some subject. A few words in their raised voices proved that they were discussing the lost pearls. Somewhat to my surprise, Mr. Lassiter took part in their argument. "It couldn't have been a burglar," Lassiter was saying, "because he would never have stolen that deed of gift. That theft proves positively the work of someone interested in behalf of the family. And so, Morland, as you can't believe there were two thieves, I think you must agree that the criminal was some interested party." "Are you accusing me?" burst out Morland. "Do you perhaps think that I raised my hand against my own father?" "I accuse nobody," said Lassiter, "but I think we ought to make more progress toward discovering the criminal. I cast no implication on Mr. Markham's work, but I do say that it is a most mysterious case, and perhaps Mr. Markham himself would like it better if he could have someone of his own profession to consult with." I was astonished that the secretary should so assert himself as to make this suggestion, for as a rule he was rather reticent and non-committal. Moreover, I knew that the one he had in mind was Fleming Stone. Morland opposed this idea, and said rather angrily that there was no use throwing away any more money on detectives when the one we had didn't amount to anything. I felt decidedly uncomfortable at this, for if I had not held him back Mr. Markham would have told the family of his recent discoveries. The glance that the detective shot at me expressed this thought, and I partly made up my mind that I would tell him to go ahead in his own way. I left the party and walked out on the terrace alone. It seemed as if I must do something desperate. I had promised Markham that if I discovered nothing about that letter by evening I would consent to his making the story public. I had vague thoughts of going straight to Anne with it, as it would be easier for her to hear about it from me alone than from the detective in the presence of others. But I couldn't bring myself to do this. I tried to think what Fleming Stone would do if he had that letter to puzzle over. And I thought at once that he would examine it to the minutest detail, even under a lens. At any rate, it was something to try; so I asked Markham for the letter, and he gave it to me unnoticed by anyone else. Remembering that there was a magnifying glass in the study, I took the letter in there. Although the scene of the crime, the great room was so beautiful that it gave no sense of horror. I crossed the soft Turkish rug to the desk that had been Mr. Van Wyck's. The lens was there, and I read the letter through it. The magnifying of it told me nothing, but as I re-read the terrible lines I could not believe they were written to Anne in good faith. I believed the letter a forgery of some sort, and I determined to find out. I had heard Stone say that typewriting was almost as individual as pen writing; that no two typewriters produced the same script, and, indeed, no two operators wrote alike, even on the same machine. And so I set to work to note any peculiarities I might find in the words or letters. At the very outset I made a discovery. This was that the typewriting on the envelope and inside the letter were not the same. There could be no doubt that they were not done on the same machine. The ink was the same color, the letters about the same size, but the conformation, though similar, was not identical. I wondered what this could mean; for surely the paper and envelope belonged to each other, and why would anyone write a letter on one typewriter and address it on another? Spurred on by this discovery, I scrutinized still more carefully, and found that in the message the capital T was imperfect. A tiny corner of one of its arms failed to print. This was a small thing, but it was a certain thing. The T on the envelope was perfectly clear and distinct. I could find no other discrepancies of this kind, but I was positive that the fact of two typewriters having been used proved chicanery of some sort. Then again, I thought perhaps a letter might print clearly at one time and not at another. As an experiment, I went to the typewriter which stood on the side table in the study and hastily wrote a few lines. I did not copy the letter or the address, but wrote a familiar quotation of some sort, followed by a whole string of letters at random. Removing my paper, I could scarcely believe my eyes as I looked at it. The capital T, in every instance, was imperfect in precisely the same manner as the one in Anne's letter. There was no doubt of this. I wrote a whole line of T's, and it was impossible to make the key printed clearly. I made further examination of my slip of paper, and found that every letter had the same peculiarities as the corresponding letters in the mysterious note. They were infinitesimal peculiarities, but they were indubitable. Whoever wrote that letter to Anne Van Wyck wrote it on that machine that was now before me, and no other. But the envelope was just as certainly not addressed on that particular typewriter. Now what did this mean? I asked myself. And it was a long time before I could grasp the answer, but it finally came to me in a flash of inspiration. As I had suspected, the letter was a forgery, It had been written on David Van Wyck's typewriter by someone who could get access to it either secretly or openly, and it had been placed in an envelope which had contained another letter already received and opened by Anne. A plan of diabolical ingenuity, of wicked cleverness. I still sat by the machine looking at the letter, when the faintest sound caught my ear, and I glanced up to see Mrs. Carstairs gliding toward me. She was just at my elbow, and was actually about to snatch the letter from my hand. Indeed, her fingers almost touched it. I stared at her and said quietly, "What does this mean? Do you want this letter?"
"Oh," she said, and her face showed a cajoling smile. "I beg your pardon, I do indeed. I thought you were copying it."
"And what if I was?" I said, partly angry and wholly mystified.
"Don't be angry," and her alluring face wore a coaxing expression. "Please give me the letter."
"Give you the letter? Why should I do that?"
She went so far as to lay her hand on my shoulder and said softly, "I know I did wrong. I ought never to have read it, but having read it I ought never to have shown it."
"I quite agree to all that, Mrs. Carstairs, but having given it into the hands of the detective, you may not take it back." I spoke sternly, even more sharply than I meant to, for I was afraid the woman's wiles would get that letter away from me against my will. Then she said, "Mr. Sturgis, please," and no words can express the persuasive power of her look and voice. "Won't you please do this, then? Copy the letter if you want to, but give me back the original." "Why?" I asked, eyeing her closely.
"Because I'm sure I did wrong to take it, and I want to restore it to Mrs. Van Wyck."
Now, of course, I had no intention of granting her request, and I'm almost sure I should not have done so, but I may as well admit that I was greatly relieved that Markham entered the room at that moment. She turned to the detective with a pretty pout that was almost girlish.
"Can't I have the letter, Mr. Markham?" she begged.
"Have the letter? Certainly not, madam. It is without a doubt a most important clue." Surely Mr. Markham was proof against her blandishments, and she realized that there was no hope to regain possession of the letter.
"Oh, well," she said, lightly, "it's of no consequence. If it gets Mrs. Van Wyck into trouble, I'm sure I can't help it. I've done all I could to retrieve what was perhaps a mistake on my part. Now she may take the consequences."
Mrs. Carstairs glided from the room, seeming not at all disappointed, but actually triumphant. "I give her up," I said to Markham. "Do you think she really wanted that letter back for Mrs. Van Wyck's benefit, or for some other reason?" "I can't think of any other reason. I think she found the letter, and brought it to me from a sense of duty. Then I think she felt sorry that she had given such awful evidence against Mrs. Van Wyck, and wanted to retract it." "Markham," I said, abruptly, "that letter was written in this room on David Van Wyck's own typewriter. Did he write it himself?" Markham seemed absolutely unable to sense my statement, which must have accounted for his absurd remark. "Of course he didn't write it himself," I said, impatiently, "but somebody wrote it on this very typewriter. Here, I'll prove it to you." I showed Markham how I had discovered the fact, and proved to him beyond any doubt that whoever wrote the letter, it had certainly been done on that machine. There were a dozen little peculiarities that made it impossible to be otherwise. "What's the answer?" said Markham, looking absolutely blank. "I don't know. If the letter is in good faith, it means an accomplice in the crime. But if the letter is a fake, which I think it is written by somebody who wants to throw suspicion on Mrs. Van Wyck. As you see, the address on the envelope is not done on this machine. That envelope, whatever its contents may have been, was mailed and delivered from the village post office last Friday. Now, Mr. Detective, solve the problem." "To begin with," said Markham, thoughtfully, "if it was done in this room, it must have been done by some member of the family." "Or some servant or some guest," I supplemented him. "No guest would do it. No servant would have opportunity to do it. And beside, the diction and construction of the note is not that of an uneducated person. Well, go over all the members of the household. Of course it was neither David Van Wyck or his wife. Equally, of course, it was neither of his children. Why not? Good heavens, man, because that's impossible. Do you suppose either Morland or Barbara connived with Anne Van Wyck to kill her husband? Absurd. But if the letter is merely a blind, well, even so, neither of those two young people would do this thing to incriminate their stepmother. Morland is more than half in love with her, and I refuse to suspect Barbara. Go through with the house guests. Archer and myself would move heaven and earth to shield Mrs. Van Wyck, rather than to bring trouble to her. Mrs. Stelton and Miss Fordyce are simply out of the question. How about the two Carstairs? That woman was certainly not in league with Mrs. Van Wyck for any purpose, but I've already told you that I'm quite ready to suspect her son. The valet? Yes. If he were in league with Mrs. Van Wyck, now keep your temper, if they were accomplices in this matter, would that not fulfill every condition of this letter? He wrote it to her, we'll say, having access to this room at certain times. Then, unable to give it to her himself, he mails it in the morning, in most ordinary fashion, and she gets it in the afternoon. I nearly throttled the man. Do you mean, then, that after this advice, Mrs. Van Wyck murdered her husband, being assured of the aid and protection of his valet? That's what I mean. And Mr. Markham gave me a quiet but meaningful glance that quelled my anger as no protestations could have done. I had to stop and think. I had known Anne only a few days, really. How could I tell of what she might be capable? And I could never forget her assertion that she was capable of crime. But to be leagued with a servant, against her husband, it was unthinkable. At last I burst out, I won't believe it. I won't listen to it. And you've left out one member of this household. What about that precious secretary? He has access to this room at all times. We know almost nothing about him. Why may it not be he who connived with his employer's wife? In the first place, said Markham, he is devoted to Miss Barbara. I fancy they're engaged. But it may be that he is really in love with Mrs. Van Wyck. I tell you, Mr. Sturgis, more crimes are committed for love than for money. Then what about Carstairs? I countered. If he had any motive, it must have been the money that he knew he would get at his master's death. He could have had no other reason. You don't suppose, do you, that he lifted his eyes to his master's wife? I don't suppose anything. And Markham passed his hand wearily over his brow. I have nothing to do with supposition. I must find tangible clues and positive evidence. I have nothing but this letter to work upon. I am glad of your aid, Mr. Sturgis, for I confess I find it a most baffling case. But unless you are willing to look at the matter from all sides, you can be of little assistance to me. I will help you all I can, Mr. Markham, but I make this condition. Don't tell of this letter quite yet. It is, as you say, a tangible clue, and I think we ought to learn something from it. But if you exploit it, you will only have panic as a result. After a little further persuasion, Markham agreed to say nothing of the letter just at present. He said we would both try our best to discover the truth from it, and I curbed my anger and indignation at his base suspicions because I really wanted to aid him. As a matter of fact, I was the only one who aided Markham in his investigations, or who even seemed interested in their results. Sometimes Anne would talk with us, but she was so contradictory and made such untenable suggestions that I could scarcely find out what her desires or intentions were. Barbara had taken the stand that she wished the investigation stopped. I could not learn her reasons for this, but I began to think it was because she feared what might be learned from them. Morland, I had reason to think, knew more about the matter than he was willing to tell. Whether he was guilty himself, or whether he knew the guilty person, I could not decide, but I was sure one or the other must be the case. I talked it all over with Condren Archer. He seemed to me to look at the matter very sensibly. "On the face of things," he said, "you must admit, Sturgis, that it looks as if one of the three Van Wycks must be implicated. So it appears to me that if we can throw suspicion elsewhere it would save the Van Wyck family." "And you would advise that?" I said in surprise. "You would willingly cast suspicion on an innocent person in order to shield one of the Van Wycks?" He looked straight at me. "Wouldn't you?" he asked. If it were Anne who was in danger?" "I don't know," I said slowly. "You ought to know," he declared. "Look here, Sturgis, what is the use of denying the truth to each other? You are in love with Anne Van Wyck, and so am I. I don't for a moment believe that she killed her husband, but if she did, I'd rather not know it. Now should we not do anything in our power to divert suspicion from her? I wouldn't accuse or convict an innocent man, but if by directing suspicion away from Anne we can save her, let us do so. And then, afterward, let the better man win her." I had little doubt from Archer's assured air that he felt certain he himself would prove the better man, but I was not so sure of this. However, for the moment I must consider his proposition. I told him that I would certainly do all in my power to shield Anne, but it was because I believed her innocent, and not because I feared she was guilty. But he merely shrugged his shoulders at this, and gave me the impression, without saying so, that he thought me insincere. End of chapters 15 and 16.